Today, I have Laura Dodson, who's been on the podcast, I think, at least 4 times now. And she has invited and connected me with Russell Habor,
Haber.
Haber, sorry, to have a conversation about Virginia Satir's family camps that she ran. Starting from what year, Laura, did the family camp start?
About
1976.
76.
Yeah,
What?
76.
Uh-huh.
Mm-hmm. And our focus, I think, with looking at and talking about the family camps is to look at this overarching theme of how to build community. You know, that was one thing that we talked about in our email correspondence, and also exploring sort of the overall purpose that Virginia set out, as well as this topic that is familiar to many therapists, the use of self. So, Laura, could I ask you to begin by sharing a little bit of the background of this camp, a little bit of the history, to give us a context?
Sure. Well, Virginia had 3 main organizations. The ILEARN, the International Human Learning Resources Network, which was a community, or is a community still, the Satir Global Community, and Family Camp. And so they're all 3 efforts of hers to join people together in community, to facilitate each other's growth and learning, and for camaraderie. And Virginia started the family camp at the request of, I'm just not remembering, but a number of therapists who wanted her to work with their families. And the suggestion was that she did it in a camp setting. And so they hiked on some trails and had the camp in various places as they hiked along for the beginning years. And then one of the members of the camp, Betsy and Bruce Wolpert, had some land on the Little Sur River and offered to create a camp there with flush toilets in the woods and black tar paper around the toilet to give privacy, and we would all tent there. And that's where I first came with my 2 children when they were 3 and 5. And that year, Virginia asked me if I would lead the camp, and I told her I couldn't because my children were so young and they needed me. So for 2 years, I did a children's program at the camp, and Virginia continued for, I think, one of those 2 years, maybe both of those years. And then I became part of a team of 3 people to lead the camp, and then the camp chose me as the main leader, our main facilitator. And that was in 1984 or 5, 1985, I think. And I continued at the camp until 3 years ago, except for some years when I had cancer and Russell came and took my place. Then when I came back, the camp was disturbed because how would they have Russell and me too? They couldn't imagine. And we decided that there should be a team of facilitators. And so Russell and I both came and invited other people to join us. Virginia had done the job all along with 60 people. We increased the camp to 120 people, because that's the maximum that the facility would hold. And then we increased our team to have leaders with the very young people and with the teenagers and young adults, as well as the general meetings every day that Russell and I did. And we all interchanged different roles.
Mm-hmm. So there's a few unique things about this camp, just by way of clarifying. One, it was a family camp. You know, a lot of camps, most camps are camps strictly for the children, and I've heard of some camps, but the majority of the time it's for the children. So this was a family camp. And the second thing that sounds different is the therapist and their family. So your children came to the camp, and did your husband come as well, or?
No, at that time, my husband was not living.
Okay. Okay. So can you tell me about those elements to the camp and what were Virginia's ideas about creating a camp like this? Um, I guess what inspired her to include families, right? Not just camps for children to have something to do over the summer, but
Well,
um,
family was her family systems was her thing.
mhm,
And she called the camp her great experiment. She was interested to know if a group of people met once a year, if they could sustain their growth, support each other, and make a difference in their lives in this way. And
mhm.
it's remarkable how that has been accomplished.
I have a funny story about that.
Mhm.
The first time I met Laura was in 1979, and then I went to a Satir conference. We had about 60 people at this 60 people training at this conference, and in a matter of days, all these 60 people hooked up with each other. So they had boyfriend and girlfriends, even though they were mostly married. And so I asked Virginia, I said, Virginia, you're a family therapist, but it seems like that the training is not promoting families. And then she told me about family camp. And she said that that was an effort of having the therapists learn with their families.
Mm, mhm.
So they're not growing apart, but they're growing together.
Okay, wonderful. So it was a space for therapists or anyone to grow um, alongside. So instead of having these isolated experiences away from their families and growing in one direction and I guess expanding their awareness or expanding their consciousness, that their whole families could be included in on that journey.
Right.
Um, could you maybe share some more ways and how that took place for you, either personally or in your roles as facilitators? How did that growth and change happen? What did that look like?
You know, we celebrated each transition in the family, the normal life transitions of kids entering adolescence and um, kids being born and coming as babies uh,
Hmm.
and entering into adulthood and marriages. Some weddings were there.
Hmm.
Um, and yeah, the young people tended to bring their girlfriends and boyfriends before they would become serious with them, or certainly before they would marry them, to see how they would do at camp,
Hmm.
because that they could communicate openly, and the way the camp did was very important to them. So those are some examples, I think, of how the camp dealt with transitions in families. Sometimes we would have all the adolescents in the front of the room, like when we were having some problems with drug issues. Their parents would be sitting behind them, and the children, the young adults, I mean, they were 13 to 18, would be speaking about drugs and camp, which was one of the big topics a few summers.
Hmm.
And the parents would be listening. And then the parents would come in, the inner circle, and the child would go outside until we could reach the point that the parents and the children would be together in support of each other.
Wow. Okay. So
Yeah.
so the teens would have their own circle. The parents would sit outside of that
Mm-hmm.
circle and just be
And a number
listening.
of people observing.
Hmm.
And the parents were pretty adamant about the kids not using drugs and not using alcohol. But then what started off as an alcohol problem turned out to be a drug problem. And the kids accused their parents of using drugs. And so it became quite an interesting dialogue.
Okay. So it came out that the parents were having an issue with the teens drinking alcohol, but then the teens pointed the finger back and said, "You guys are using drugs," and so it was this exchange back and forth.
Right.
Can you share about how that was resolved, or if there was resolution?
Well, I think that a number of adults got into AA because of those kinds of meetings. And we have an AA group that meets at the camp usually about 3 times a week. And so it really profoundly changed their lives.
Mm. Can you go like deeper into the experience, what you remember about what was happening? What was the process like that, people, it sounded like they were able to have productive, open, congruent conversations with one another. How you facilitated that, what helped that in terms of the environment. Yeah, can you just share a little bit more of the process, what was
Well,
going on
we
at the
used
camp?
a fishbowl. So we had one group on the inside, one group on the outside. And then we just were there just getting people to speak their truth.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of love in the camp. People have watched these children grow up from their birth, many of them, and it come when they were a few weeks old. And so the support behind the families in these issues was quite incredible. The love and caring that was there.
Yeah, I just want to be able to understand a few things. How long were the people in this camp, like in the summer? Like what would the duration be?
From a Saturday till the following Saturday.
So 1 week.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And then would there be contact or meetings between the summer, the week?
Yes, the camp in time became independent, running itself with a camp committee. It always had a camp committee, but it took them a while to see that that camp committee was in charge of the camp, not us as facilitators.
Mm-hmm.
And the camp committee met 3 times a year and continues to meet 3 times a year, even now during the pandemic, meeting on Zoom. And they've decided not to have camp this summer, which has been a major decision.
They're going to have a virtual camp.
A virtual camp, yeah. So,
okay. So these profound, I'm really impressed because these profound connections happen in only, 1 week with 120 people. When you talk about the committee meeting 3 times a week, though,
3 times a year.
Sorry, 3 times a year.
Right.
Like, would that, like, who comprises the committee?
Well, the committee is chosen by the camp. It would be about, and one could decide to join the committee as well. It's an open group.
I think the rule is that they have to be there 2 years. After 2 years, they can self-join the committee.
But they can also come to the committee meetings even if they're not committee members. And they can come to the committee meetings on Zoom or Skype if they're committee members or otherwise also. So those committee meetings can sometimes be 30 or more people. And they are groups that begin with meditation and report in, each one speaking about what is happening in their lives at this time. So they're immensely supportive as well as the camp.
Okay. Yeah, I want to understand the elements that go into creating the community and what are the elements that are part of the process. Because what you describe, I think, is such a missing element. Like in my work with teens, my work with couples and families, I'm just trying to imagine, what it would be like to have this kind of support where you're not just dealing with your kid one-on-one, but you have this community, this energy around you where it's like, okay, I'm not alone. I've got facilitators, I've got other parents around me. There's other kids having this experience. It seems to add something, and it's related to what you were talking about in terms of also being able to celebrate transitions. It's not just coping with the challenges, but being able to celebrate life, to celebrate transitions. How did people use that support, whether, as peers, as teens, or as the younger people, or as parents? Like, how did you see that as an important factor to building community, the support amongst or between people?
Often when somebody would work in the teen group or the young adult group or in the large group where everyone or anyone could attend, the issue that a person worked on, or several persons might have worked, would become information for the whole community around how they could support them. So all during the week, if that person fell into the complex that they had spoken about, someone in the camp might point it out to them and support them and help them find alternative behaviors. So all week long was a therapeutic community. All week long, whatever people offered up was community information there for people to support each other with.
And people know each other pretty well. It's not uncommon that people come every year, and I've been coming 27 years to camp. And so I've seen children become parents and, you know, witness them through all their different life cycles.
So they create these lifelong bonds with the camp. What are some of the ingredients to the Satir family camp that's maybe different from other camps? Like what are some important ingredients that make it what it is?
My son came at age 5 initially. His bonds were so great with the young boys. And now he comes back, or had been coming back when I was coming until I retired 3 years ago. He came back with his children and his wife, and his friends came back gradually with their children. And some of them didn't come when their children were so little. But by the time I left, I felt the camp was really ready for me to go, because the people my son's age were coming back with their spouses and their children that were between ages of about maybe 2 to 10. And these young people were becoming leaders of the camp. They were speaking out. They were part of the committee. They were impacting the community. So that new generation was ready to take over, and that let me know that the camp was ready for me to go also.
What I'm wondering about is what made this camp unique and powerful that people like your son would want to come back, you know, so many years later. How is it affecting people? What made it different than other camps?
Well, the camp is dedicated to growth. And so the focus is on communication, congruence, and all that raises people's self-esteem. So that people, like one of the early years I went to camp, I was walking across the meadow and I saw this person stop. These two boys were fighting, and another camper stopped and kind of coached them how not to fight and how to speak to each other. And these kind of experiences happen all day long, that people are part of a community and they recognize that they're part of a community.
The support people feel in their growth and the ability to communicate congruently is not present everywhere in the world, but in this community is present all week long. And the meditations and the community meetings in the morning allow people to center deeply and become in touch more with their own self. So I think people return because they feel more in touch deeply with themselves and with other people, and they feel seen.
And I think the work that people do in front of the group is very important, because they bare their souls and then they become known and their problems become known. And so people, when they see people, they see them at a depth that is unusual. It's not typical.
Yeah, and this, you know, I know that you move, just I guess for legal reasons, away from the word therapeutic and more to facilitating. But it sounds like what happened to the people that witnessed other people doing their work? I mean, I imagine that had an effect. What effect did it have on the people that were maybe not the star of a process or something like that? What happened?
Well, after the piece of work, people would share. They would come up and and share. And so many people would come up, and there were many tears and much commonality. People saw themselves in the person that had worked.
Mm-hmm. So they become quite vulnerable themselves.
Yes.
What was the structure of the camp as it related to the facilitation of process of doing a piece of work? Was it spontaneous? Was it structured? Like how did that look? Like was it every day there'd be an opportunity for a piece of work, or with the group witnessing and supporting? Like maybe give me a sense of that.
It was sometimes spontaneously, but other times people would request time to sort something out. And so we would do both. Like they would tell one of the facilitators that they've been really troubled by something and they really want to do a piece of work. And then Laura or I would work with them in front of the group.
But the group was organized in such a way that in the morning we had temperature reading, which would last anywhere between an hour and an hour and a half. And though it can be long, it became a sacred place for the camp where people could really, in the structure of saying appreciations and the structure that Virginia had for temperature reading, people could say what they really felt and what they really wanted. And after the temperature reading, there was a break for snacks, and then we had our morning session. And that was every day except one day. One day we had a family sort of drawing session, or family community session, not a working session where we work in front of the group, but we might draw our family or something like that. And then one day of the week, on Wednesday, we had what we called free university, when anyone in the camp could present anything, could put down what they wanted to present, and whoever came, they would present to those people. But the other days we had a community meeting in the morning in which somebody worked, and one in the afternoon in which somebody worked. And sometimes more than one person if we had more time. And then each day, or 3 days a week, we had women's group and we had a men's group. Also during the week, sometimes the elders met as a group, and at the request of the group. That's how these things are determined. The teens met usually about 4 times a week. The young adults met, and parents met, particularly young parents. Sometimes young parents in one group and parents of teenagers in another group, just to check in and talk with each other. And what meetings there were each time we came, in addition to the basic ones of the community meeting and the teens and the young adults, would be determined by what the group wanted, whether they wanted the couples group or whatever. So that's the general structure. Then at the mealtime in the evening, which was usually a wonderful feast, we had a great cook. Then we'd have our evening time, which often would be a social time of a family bingo or some other activity in the evening.
Which would involve the whole group?
Involve the whole group, yes. Those who wanted to come.
Or it could be a couple people playing guitar, kids playing cards, so that it would be around the same area, but there'd be many different types of connections.
Right. We also had a book of pictures of people who were at the last camp, but not at this camp. And it was possible to write love notes to those people that were mailed to them.
What were there explicit, like it sounds like a lot of these groups were support groups. You would do sort of a piece of work as people requested it. In terms of teaching Virginia's work and her model, were there explicit pieces that were taught to the group, or was it all informal?
Yeah. Often there was. Sometimes when a theme would emerge that evoked in our minds as facilitators some of Virginia's tools, then we would use that tool as part of the large group meeting in the mornings or afternoons.
Okay. And so are you talking about doing a tool, using a tool like a parts party or a family reconstruction?
Right.
Pieces of family reconstruction,
Okay.
yeah, and
Okay.
parts of a parts party,
Okay.
yeah.
What other explicit pieces of Virginia's work would you teach? For example, would you explicitly talk about the five freedoms? Would you teach about the stances? Like what things would you explicitly teach at the camp?
Yes, all those things.
Okay.
And sometimes when we hadn't found an occasion to have that evoked from the group, but it's been a while since we had um, put out some of Virginia's ideas and new people had started coming to the camp, then we would just take that opportunity to lay out some framework so that people had that.
Mm-hmm. So I want you both to imagine, like, I want to start a community, maybe in the form of a camp or in the form of a community locally or something like that, that involved, whole families. What would the pieces, in terms of Virginia's work, what would be important pieces that you would want as part of the curriculum or part of the I don't know what you would call it as it relates to camps, but as part of the foundation of the camp that would enable the camp to be able to connect and create a deep connection in the way that you're describing? What would those pieces of Virginia's work be?
Well, I've done family camps in Moscow and in Lithuania and in Czechoslovakia, and those people came together as families, and they hadn't necessarily, most of them hadn't had exposure to Virginia. So the camp began with communication stances and basic tools of Virginia's work, what congruent communication meant, and practicing congruent communication, and began with family systems, understanding Virginia's idea of family systems and family maps, and people doing something of their own family map. So a lot of teaching tools were offered in every session, followed by some space that was left open for people who wanted to do a piece of work.
Were most people that came to the camp, at least one member of the family system, already exposed to some of Virginia's work? Or were there people coming to the camp, entire families that were completely unaware? Or
in our camp, someone can come at the invitation of someone else who's in the camp. That's the only way you can enter. And that may be someone who doesn't have exposure to Virginia.
And there were whole families that were unaware of Virginia, but came to camp because they heard of the camp and they liked the idea of being out in the woods. And I think the nature is also another important part of camp, that it gives time for people to be away from cell phones, computers, social media, and just gets them a time to get in touch with themselves and in the environment.
And those things are not allowed at camp, those phones and the use of phones. And anyway, the connection's so poor, that helps us out.
Yeah, it's good to have that at this point, digital detox, as everyone's so attached to their technology. So the people, they would be staying in tents? Is that, what was the physical structure? Like, where would people sleep and where would they eat?
Yeah. People were in tents. It really was comfortable camping. I had a cot in my tent and a air mattress. I can't say I suffered very much about being in the woods.
Okay.
There were hot showers, and so it was pretty comfortable.
We have a fantastic cook, so we have wonderful food.
So we had
always snacks out.
Salmon, steak, hamburgers, enchiladas.
Wow. Sign me up. I want to go.
Yeah,
A lot of
it's
people
really
come for the
wonderful.
food.
Yeah. Um,
Every at the camp, another piece of the structure is that there's a representative from each group, like from the adult group, from the adolescent group, from the young adult, from couples. And this group of people meet every morning at breakfast time. When I
mhm.
thought about eating, I thought about sitting with that group of people. All the facilitators come to that meeting, and these people, and their job is to report in anything that the facilitators need to know that's happening in their
Ah,
group.
okay. Yeah, what the dynamic is like within those subgroups.
Right.
Okay. Neat. Um, so it seemed like there's like a good systemic organization to relay information back and forth about the overall group dynamic amongst the whole. Um, what were some of the lessons learned? Because I imagine there was many bumps along the road. Were there specific things that you guys figured out and said, well, this is really important. We have to include this, or this is a structure we need to be implanted. Like, what were some of the lessons learned that helped build more safety and greater community?
Well, I think for the camp to take ownership of the camp was one of the biggest things, because Virginia was a very strong leader and she did all this by herself. And people came focused on Virginia. And we didn't want people to focus on us and see us as the leader and their purpose for being there and the one that carries all the responsibility for the camp itself. We wanted the camp committee to represent the camp and the camp to own itself and hire us as facilitators. And that took some doing. And I think it culminated when I was ill with cancer and out of the group, and Russell was there, so he could tell you how they came to that, if that's something that would be good to fill in.
So I just want to understand the transition. So Virginia, you said, was a strong leader. She did a lot of things, and people were, drawn to learn from her. But then there was this need to put some of the onus or responsibility back onto the camp itself, and then therefore this committee was formed. Um, I guess I'm not understanding
Well, the
like what.
committee was already there with Virginia, but
Mhm.
they weren't empowered. They gave all the power to Virginia.
Oh, I see. Okay.
And we didn't want them to give all the power to us. We wanted to empower them.
Right. Because it just, I imagine, became overwhelming because you probably ended up doing everything. Is that why? And
Well,
they were.
no, it's just a matter of working on their self-esteem and not projecting power that they had themselves.
Hmm. Hmm. Okay.
The camp became self-generating, so that the camp itself could run without facilitators at
Mm.
this point. And so, like going through the pandemic crisis, the camp is communicating with each other. They set up a network and they've been communicating with each other. And I don't think they could have done that 25 years ago. They would have been too dependent on a leader to organize things for them.
Okay, so this is interesting because this part is particularly fascinating because I think, and I don't want to get into the details of it, but I think a similar thing happened with Avanta, where organizationally there was a lot of challenges when Virginia died, um, and I guess this speaks to organizational structures, which I'm not too familiar with. But what um, what was what helped the system organize well enough that it could be self-generating? I guess what are there some details that you could point to about leadership, about teamwork, about values that helped the camp become self-generating?
Well, the values were communication and congruence and to earn your own power, just or
Mm,
to be in charge of your own growth. And I think that those concepts became embedded in people. I
mm,
think also there was a number of very, very strong people in the community, so that people that were in leadership roles were ready to assume leadership. And so the presidents have been very important in the process.
What was mentorship? I imagine that mentorship was an important part of developing these leaders. Is there something specific about this camp and maybe related to Virginia's work about mentorship? It sounded like people were part of this camp over a long, long period of time. What did that look like in this camp?
Well, mentorship was very important. And there was a group of people that were assuming the role of leaders, but then they were challenged to have leadership that was outside of this group of powerful people. And, with the young people, there was a need for having young people step into some of these leadership roles. And so there were a couple of years where the senior leadership was bemoaning the fact that there wasn't any new leaders and that they were getting tired and that the camp was going to die out, that once these leaders, there would be no one to replace them. And then the young adults, as they had their own kids and came back and had their own jobs, they really embraced the role of leadership. And so now you have leaders that were kids and have really stepped up and owned the fact of their leadership.
Mm-hmm. Was it their kind of natural personality, their disposition for leadership, or was there something in the camp itself that helped nurture that in these people?
Well, my son told me a number of years ago, and he said, when you stop coming to the camp, I'm going to continue coming to the camp. So he was no longer coming as the son of a facilitator, but coming in his own right. Mm-hmm. And he became part of the governing committee. And he was one of those people on Skype because we were in South Carolina. And so he came to the meetings and really developed his own approach.
Mm-hmm. And there's Russell, there's a theme in the paper that you wrote on family camp, and hopefully, is it okay if I post it on the website so people can read it? Is that okay? Sure. Yeah. One of the things that you wrote is this theme of becoming a peer with your parents, especially for the teens, that transition period, as you're transitioning to becoming a peer or equal. Can either of you speak to that theme of how that manifested in the camp?
Well, I think that concept is from Don Williamson, who looked at the idea of becoming a peer with your parents. And so I think that the children had to grow in a way that wasn't dictated by their parents, and that becoming a peer means that they would own their own voice.
There was a wonderful moment I'd like to tell. It's a kind of humorous thing that happened. Maureen and Graves and Tom Graves and I retired from the camp at the same time 3 years ago. And we were sharing this we shared it with the group in the first temperature reading. And in each temperature reading, it seemed to come up. And my son was leading one of the temperature readings. And Maureen was saying again some things that she had said before about leaving. And Jonathan said, okay, enough of that. And everybody in the audience, which are all these young people Jonathan's age, laughed because it was so beautiful that John had asserted his leadership role and told his elders, his parents' age and his parent, that's enough. And let's move on. And it was so beautiful when everybody laughed.
So the message was like a confidence of we're going to be okay, even though you're going. Was that like
Yeah,
yeah.
and we have already heard you. We can
Okay.
move on.
Mm,
And I think the nature of family therapy is to encourage each person to have their own voice. There was one time I was leading a session, and I said to this guy, this was the first year that I was there, and I said to this person, it's too bad that your father is not here to hear you. And he said, yeah, my father's in the third row. And so then I brought his father out, and then he was able to assert himself with his father. So it's this business of finding your own voice with your parents.
mm. I wonder in the context of this camp and the community, how did you balance what Virginia would call the seed model, or the essence of people with the various roles and the idea of power, right? People have responsibilities and power. How did you manage things, the function of those roles, that things needed to get done, and how people can sometimes um, get kind of lost or confused, kind of identify too much with a particular role and then lose the connection to self. How, in what you're describing, this transition to becoming a peer with your parents, how did the camp manage role identity with being an authentic self? Does this make sense, this question? Like, this is a theme I'm wondering about.
Well, I think one important facet of camp is the jobs that people have to do. And everyone signs up for 4 jobs a week, and they're held accountable that they would do those jobs. So that
Which includes helping the cook in the kitchen, cleaning the bathrooms, cleaning the area where we have temperature reading,
pool duty,
various things.
Okay.
and so that people would be signing up for latrine duty, and they would model that they can clean up the latrines, and that was their job. And so people didn't associate with, they looked at the function of making the place a better place for everybody,
Mm-hmm.
rather than looking at it as a job that's beneath them.
When you say that do you mean like people in leadership roles would take on those chores and model that they're not above any particular task? Is that what you mean?
Sure. And everybody took jobs.
Yeah.
So the only people that didn't have jobs were people under 10 and over 80.
Oh, okay. Okay. Yeah. And
We
so
had
it's like,
one woman that came to the camp, and she was 93. And she said, I just can't do the jobs. And people loved her and said, well, please come to camp and don't worry about the jobs.
mm-hmm. Can I ask either of you to speak to your own personal, like it sounds like camp was a place that you loved, and the roles that you got to play in connection to it and continue to play with it was very meaningful to you. Can you speak to maybe the impact that the camp had on your life personally, or yeah?
Well, I
That's
think,
where my children saw me work, and they understood my profession, and we developed more facile communication between us as well.
Mm-hmm.
Excuse me, Russell.
when I started camp, I came with my wife, who was a facilitator, and my son. And I think that everybody really were curious about us when we came, and they were curious about our family. And I think that people liked me because they liked my son so much that they liked me. But it was a shared experience that the 3 of us shared with each other.
Mm-hmm.
And it brought us closer together. and that we brought in some of the language, some of the people from camp stay with us all year round.
Sorry, say that again. That last bit. Some people from the camp stayed with you all year round. What do you mean?
Well, they stay with us in terms of our inner psyches.
Oh, I see. I see.
And my son stayed in touch with a lot of the young adults.
Even today, my son texts back and forth to all these people, and he's been to every wedding of his peers there, and they were his.
Wow. That's so fascinating. Yeah, it's something, and what brings a smile to my face is just kind of whatever I understand about Virginia's work. One of the things that when I've done some intensive trainings and just the connection that you make, but then feeling like there isn't a way to integrate that because there isn't that space on an ongoing fashion. And it sounds like family camp is a way to teach these concepts and to have these experiences, and the roots of these bonds are so deep, and I see it and I witness it in communities like I Learn and what you're describing here, where people develop these lifelong connections that are so meaningful. And I think that speaks to the profound impact that Virginia's work can have.
Early on when I met Virginia in 1963, one of the first things she said to me is, "Oh, I want you to meet Joan Herrick," and "Oh, I want you to meet Marty Steiner." And these are people who were studying with her in her first program at the Miller Research Institute in Palo Alto. She wanted to connect us to each other. And that's why she started iLearn.
It's really, I think family camp is the best way to get a sense of what Virginia was all about, because family camp embodies her teaching and embodies her principles. And then you really see it working out in a group of people. It's just fascinating.
She saw it as her great experiment, and she really didn't know if it would be effective. And she was astounded to see that people kept wanting to come back, and that the children who grew up there were different sorts of folks than kids that didn't grow up at camp. They did communicate more clearly and more openly and more straightforward. So she was feeling that her experiment was successful, even though anyone would have said that once a week every year is not going to develop personal growth.
Yeah, no, that's when you said 1 week a year, I couldn't believe it. It seems like such a short period of time.
But that 1 week, you really see people grow. So you see infants grow up to become teenagers.
Yeah. Did you guys ever try experimenting with a longer period of time? Did you land on 1 week being the ideal? What was that?
I think mainly because it's difficult for people to get vacations and take time off of work.
Yeah, so it wasn't practical. Russell, can I come back to something you were saying? You said when you first came to the camp, I think to come in place of Laura when she was sick, and you brought your family, you brought your son and your wife. Is your background in psychology, or what's your background?
In family therapy.
Okay, so as a family therapist, you're coming into this context. What was that like for you in terms of, one, needing to work out boundaries, and how are you thinking about how to reconcile that? And yeah, I guess Laura, you would have had the same kind of puzzle to work through. But can you speak to boundaries and how you manage that, or thought about it?
I think coming with as a family, I had my own natural boundary. So when the three of us would be eating together, people would just leave us alone. So there was a sense of time. Our time was respected.
Yeah, in this time of the pandemic, I'm doing all my sessions online, and my family's just in the next room, or sometimes my son will be crying, or there's something, and so that's closer to home. But I think in this, in being in the camp, living together, cooking together, eating together, is there an element of being together that is in the role of therapist that is beneficial for families to see, or beneficial in both directions? I wonder what ingredient or what does that add in that's different than the formal therapeutic setting?
I think my wife and I always had a challenge finding campsites, and so we would argue about campsites, and the campers found this to be quite humorous. And so I think then seeing it takes away some of the glamour of being a therapist, that you're naked taking a shower with somebody, and they get to see you in different aspects, and they see you in functioning as a fellow camper, because part of the job of our job is being a part of the camp as well as facilitating the camp.
Hmm.
And I think that's really important for people to see that.
Were there families that you worked with, people that you worked with, Laura and Russell, that you would invite to the camp?
Yeah.
That happened occasionally.
Mm-hmm.
Invite to the camp as campers or as facilitators.
Both.
Okay, so in either case.
Yeah.
Okay.
But
So
I've had about 3 or 4 people that I worked with became facilitators. And then
that you worked with therapeutically that became facilitators.
I work with collegially.
And you help train them.
Colleagues and trainees that came as facilitators.
I see. Okay.
But also, I was very careful when I was inviting a client to come to camp. I wanted to be sure about our relationship, that they could take in the camp and not just focus on me. And I wanted to feel that they had a certain level of psychological maturity and were able to use the camp for their growth, not just be in a dependent situation upon me or upon the camp, and that they could take in a community. So yes, some wonderful, wonderful people have come that have been my clients.
Yeah.
And of course, in the time of the camp, several of our campers have died. And when you mention that, I'm thinking about Rhonda, who's a client of mine who came to camp, and she has died of cancer this last year. But she came and she brought the man that she later married, and they worked on their relationship and then came together, and she brought her daughters, and then they came and brought their boyfriends, and their children, and then her sister came, and her sister's husband and their children, and so that was a very successful example of bringing a client who was also a psychologist herself. It was lovely.
And Laura,
process.
you also brought a lot of international therapists.
Yes.
Yeah, as you're describing this community and this camp, it makes me think of, one of my wishes is that in some ways, I mean, I say this kind of half jokingly, that therapists, the formal context of therapy can one day disappear. And what we're doing is we're learning to learn skills to be loving with one another that are not, relegated to a specific context, that communally we learn to support one another. We learn how to speak, you're talking about these very general things that are so helpful to communicate congruently, to take responsibility for your own voice, to listen, to really listen to one another, to support one another. And I think, we can live in such isolation sometimes, and particularly in this context of the pandemic, that the idea of community is really lost. Can you speak to your own perception of that, or if that fits with how you think, or maybe the need of a camp like this? Is community missing um, in our modern society, and um, and if so, are there lessons from the camp that we can take and integrate into our daily lives?
Well, I think so. In our life, we don't really know our neighbors very well.
Mm-hmm.
And so here's a community where you feel known by 120 people. And there's some comfort in feeling known and being seen.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it was Virginia's, what you just said, Tim, is Virginia's vision for raising world consciousness. That where would be not you versus me, but you and me, and a sense of community in the world, and that this would be the transformation, the raising of consciousness that she felt was her life mission,
Mm-hmm.
raising of consciousness in the world.
Mm-hmm.
And camp would be a small modular of that.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, you've used that word experiment a few times, that we're experimenting, and I think we need to do more experimentation of what are the forms of connection that we need to raise world consciousness, to inject the world with more peace. And one of the things that I'm wondering, like I see as a great possibility, is our ability to connect online has a greater potential than I thought initially as we've moved into this time. So hopefully that can be a form where we can feel a genuine sense of community and experience, and to bring more peace, within and between and amongst each other. Is there anything else? I mean, I think maybe by way we'll need to start kind of closing, but is there anything at this moment that you would like to share about your experiences, the lessons learned?
Well, I think that there's a magic at camp, and just being part of the camp is being part of that magic. Each year I played the blues, and for me it was my way of saying what my experience was at camp. And I think I got really close to our fellow facilitators, to Laura, to Tom, Maureen, Shirley, Ray, Malcolm. These are all people that were there.
Mm-hmm.
And so I really loved being at camp.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's been an important part of my life.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I've been in different trainings. There's one with Maria Gamore that comes to mind, and it was a training amongst, there's a particular mental health clinic in Ontario in Canada. And so she was doing a piece of work with a family, and there was the group of professionals sitting around, and Laura, we met, we've been talking sort of virtually, and she did a piece of work with me as the star that I learned last fall. And similarly, there was a group of people sitting around me. And I'm thinking of those images as you're describing camp, that being encircled by a supportive group, a supportive energy. I think it amplifies the energy of healing and of consciousness, the idea of raising consciousness. I think you've both given me a lot of inspiration to think about Virginia's work in a larger and larger context, and how we can expand and integrate her work with a larger idea of community. So yeah, I want to thank you for sharing about this experience as a concrete form of her work that I've never had the chance to speak to anyone about. I've read the book. There's a book about Satir Family Camp. But to speak to you and to hear the emotion that you both share of your love for this camp, I yearn for community. So hopefully, hopefully I can experience something like this